All right, great. Well, thank you for joining us today for another in DPR's series of virtual information meetings intended to help you prepare your proposal applications for the Research and Alliance Grant programs. Today's is the second of 3 talks that cover budgets and budget justifications. My name is Jordan Weibel. I'm the Research Grants Program Lead. And we're going to go through a bunch of material today, and we're going to move pretty quickly, but we should have some time at the end for questions that may arise. And we'll also be providing contact information for any follow-ups that you may develop as you put this information into action. So what is the purpose of the budget and budget justification? These are really vital tools that provide reviewers with some of the best information on the relative value of your project. And they serve to demonstrate that the project costs are appropriate, that they're not too high, not too low, and that the described work has been well planned. And we're going to use a number of different terms today, but some important definitions up front. First, direct costs. These are costs that can be specifically identified with the particular grant project and can be directly assigned to grant activities. So these are things like lab consumables, postdoctoral research salaries, travel costs, kind of the nuts and bolts of doing the project. Modified total direct costs are a subcategory of direct costs, and these include all salaries and wages, fringe benefits, materials, supplies, services, travel, consultants, and the first $25,000 of each subaward. So there's a portion of a cost called indirect costs that then are calculated off of these modified total direct costs and added to the cost of the grant. And the indirect costs are essentially the costs of doing grant business that can't be associated specifically with any grant project. So these are things like general building maintenance, support services, library operation, or administrative services for your institution. An overview of what the budget and budget justification look like in DPR's proposal applications. These must be submitted using the provided scope of work and budget section of the proposal application. And that proposal application and all materials that we'll discuss today can be found on our website. The Research Grants Proposal Application materials or the Alliance Grants Proposal Application materials sites all can be found off of our grants main page. We'll be providing the addresses of those later, but they're easily found with a quick Google search. Applicants can use internal software to prepare the budget calculations, but we do need you to input those values into DPR's provided documents in the application materials. We then go through and manually verify all the values in the budget using the numbers provided in the budget justification. So it's important that your numbers are accurate and reflect what's in the budget justification. The first budget-related table that you'll be filling out in your proposal application is the task budget table. This is intended to be an estimate of what portion of those total direct costs that we described will be allocated to each individual task. And this helps reviewers essentially see what the relative value or relative cost of each task is. They should be entered into the task column for each task, and the amount of personnel, travel, materials and supplies, subcontractor costs, all those things should be wrapped up into one number and put in each line for each task. The total costs must add up to the total direct cost of the grant, and we're going to provide an example of that in a second. And they must also match the total in the main budget table. So here's an example, and throughout the talk today, we're going to be providing a number of examples, and all of these examples are sourced from 2 guidance documents that we've provided this year in the Alliance Grants Proposal Application and materials and the Research Grant Proposal Application materials sites. You can find a guidance document for each program respectively. Within these guidance documents is a sample scope of work and budget. And there you'll find laid out a filled out example of each of the portions that we're going to talk about today. Even if you're only considering applying for one of our 2 programs, I would encourage you to look at both, because having multiple examples of these, and they look quite similar, can be useful in determining the answer to some questions you might have. So here, to remind you, as we look further into the main budget table in a second, the task budget table on the left, the number in the bottom right corner, that project total direct cost, must match exactly the total direct cost listed in the main budget table on the right. Those numbers are arrived at essentially independently, and left by the sum of the total of tasks, and on the right, the sum of the total of the categories, and also across the row, the sum of the direct cost by year. So we are building in multiple ways in these tables to check your math essentially. But I would really encourage you to carefully review your numbers as you go through your budget and budget justification to make sure that there aren't errors. All right, so we're going to dig into the main budget table, and we're going to spend quite a bit of today's talk discussing this main budget table and all the pieces of it. This is one of the main tools that reviewers are going to use, and it's a place that they commonly look to make sure that the costs are appropriate. This gives a good general overview of how much is devoted to certain categories, and the amount of personnel, travel, materials, and supplies. All these things need to be entered into the appropriate categories. And an important note here, some institutions do use dollars and cents in their budget tables, but we would ask that you round all costs to the nearest whole dollar when you're filling out these tables. The total cost per year and the total cost for the overall project, so essentially you can think moving down the column or across the row, must add up correctly. And those are numbers that DPR is going to verify as we review your budget. So please ensure that those all add up correctly. And again, we know that some applicants will be preparing these numbers using different software. So once you've transferred them into this budget table, please double check them and make sure that they're still accurate. And then all values that are entered in this table must be fully justified in the budget justification. And we'll talk a lot more about the budget justification after we get through talking about this table. But the budget justification essentially breaks down each of these categories and describes the purpose of each of these costs line by line. All right, starting from the top in the main budget table. First and foremost, fill out the name of the principal investigator and the principal investigator's organization. And a note on principal investigators with DPR, we have a slightly different definition than some institutions. And I'm going to reference a number of times today our terms and conditions, which all applicants need to certify that they've read and understood. The definition of principal investigator can be found there, and it is useful to go and look at. Those terms and conditions can be found on the proposal application materials site for the relevant program that you're applying to. So again, that's the Alliance Grants Proposal Application Materials or the Research Grants Proposal Application Materials website. And then we're going to hit this point a number of times through today's talk as well. But year 3 for these projects is only 6 months in length this year and runs from the start of the fiscal year on July 1st, 2025 through December 31st, 2025. So costs should be accordingly justified and laid out. Similarly, on the front end, while research grants are projected to begin on July 1st and have a whole fiscal year to work with from July 1st through June 30th, Alliance grants are not projected to begin until September 1st. This means that year 1 should be budgeted for only 10 months rather than the full 12. All right, so the first line that you'll actually fill numbers in the main budget table is personnel. And this is going to be another theme that we hit a lot of times today, but to receive grant funds as personnel, staff must be paid through the same organization as the principal investigator. And this is going to be true for travel, materials and supplies, equipment, rent, and many of the other direct costs that might get included in projects. Anything that is not charged through the PI's institution must be listed as a subcontractor or a subrecipient as may be appropriate. We'll talk more about those definitions later. Combine all the salaries and fringe benefits for all the individuals being paid through the principal investigator's organization on that personnel line and break it down by year. And then ensure that those salaries and fringe benefits in particular are accurate by year, making sure that again, for alliance grants in year 1, you're budgeting for 10 months. And then in year 3 for both research and alliance, that you're budgeting for 6 months. Next, we're going to move on to travel. Travel has one very important condition associated with it. Travel is only allowed within the state of California using grant funds. If you would like to conduct travel outside of California, you'll need to support that travel with other funding. Any travel funded by the grant must be included in the budget table and then fully justified in the travel budget justification. Combine all travel costs for all individuals being paid, again, only through the PI's organization on the travel line. And as we'll discuss when we get to the subcontractor and subrecipient, each subcontractor and subrecipients are going to fill out another budget table and budget justification where they can break all these costs out and describe them appropriately. There's a number of different rules for travel that are specific to institution, and in particular reimbursement rates and appropriate costs for things like per diem and lodging vary from institution to institution. So make sure as you're filling out your budget table and justification that you're using the appropriate rates. For non-UC and CSU applicants, the rules you must adhere to are found in Cal HR's travel policy. And another note here, the PDF of today's slides will be available on our website as well. So if you're looking for a clickable link to visit these websites, please view that PDF on our website. University of California applicants must adhere to their specific travel policy. Similarly, Cal State University applicants have their own university travel policy that they must adhere to. For any federal or tribal agency applicants, please reach out if you have any questions on specific terms, conditions, policies that you may be bound by that may differ from those found here. And for all of these, if you have questions on any of these specifics, and in particular, you do not feel that your organization might be able to comply with any of these things, please reach out ahead of time before submitting your proposal application. The next line item is materials and supplies. And materials and supplies is a relatively broad category that we ask you to combine on this line item, things like laboratory consumables, tools, compost, software subscriptions, and lots more. The addition of a material that is not included in the approved budget may require a grant amendment. So try to think about which materials and supplies you'll need to execute the project and include some amount of them in your list of materials and supplies that you'll provide in the budget justification. Next, equipment. Equipment is something that is defined a bit differently depending on the institution as well. DPR's definition that you must adhere to for your proposal application and grant is defined as something that has a useful life of at least 1 year. It has an acquisition cost of at least $5,000 and has been purchased with grant funds. That's one portion of it, but there's another definition that is any product, object, machinery, apparatus, implements, or tools purchased, used, or constructed within the grant, including those products, objects, machinery, apparatus, implements, or tools, from which over 30% of the equipment is composed of materials purchased for the grant. So essentially what we're saying there is if the grant is constructing, say, novel equipment that is largely paid for by grant funds, it may fall under the rules of equipment as well. So if you have questions on your specific project and something that might be appropriately categorized as equipment, you can definitely reach out on those. In any case, combine all equipment costs for the project on the equipment line by year. And similar to personnel, travel, materials, and supplies, this is only for the PI's main institution. Any equipment being purchased by a subcontractor or subrecipient should go in those respective budgets. Next, we have rent, and this is rent of many types, things like facility rental, rental of items or tools, and other things like that. should be included on the rent line. All right, now we're going to begin talking about subcontractors, and we're going to touch on subcontractors a number of times throughout this talk and many of the different aspects that go into calculating, in particular, the indirect costs associated with them. And this is an area that we often see people having questions or making mistakes. So please feel free to reach out if you develop questions on this topic area. Subcontractors, we define as an independent entity that will be collaborating with or providing a service to the applicant to complete the objectives of the grant. So essentially somebody working on the project that is not paid by the principal investigator's institution. Combine all of these costs into the subcontractor line for each individual subcontractor and provide multiple subcontractor lines by adding lines to the table if you have multiple subcontractors. In our base example, or in the base budget table, there is one line for a subcontractor and one line for subrecipient, but you're allowed to have multiple of each if needed. An important note, each of these subcontractors and subrecipients will need their own budget table and budget justification. Often these include fewer and less complex things than the main budget table, but they should be just as well justified, and the math in them should also be well checked for any errors. If the project includes those multiple subcontractors, again, make sure that they have their own line in the budget table. Subrecipients are a specific classification for University of California and Cal State University applicants. And if you're confused about any rules on those, we have a number of documents that are on our website that can help you make the determination of if something would be a subcontractor or a subrecipient. And like subcontractors, subrecipients should have their own budget line for each subrecipient, including indirect cost, as well as their own budget table and budget justification. The main difference between a subcontractor and a subrecipient that we'll talk more about later is that subrecipients do not have indirect costs applied to the main budget, even up to the first $25,000 like you would see in a subcontractor. Then this large list of ODCs or other direct costs, and this is essentially anything that doesn't fall in one of these other budget categories. So for each of these, provide a cost breakdown for things like insurance, graduate student tuition, information technology. That's not an exhaustive list. There's many things that might qualify as other direct costs. And then determine whether each of those costs is subject to indirect costs and mark it accordingly in the table. If you have questions on those, I would refer you first to the terms and conditions, which has a wealth of information on how to determine which costs are subject to indirect cost calculation and which aren't. And if you have more other direct costs than the ones provided, feel free to add additional lines to the table.
I'm sorry, this is Moj. Got a quick question.
Yes.
Crop insurance and crop destruct falls under this category?
I believe it would, yes. I would have to double check on that, but I think that's accurate, yes.
Thanks.
Yep. So then we move on to the summary line for these direct costs. So add up all the costs in the budget table for each year vertically and enter the values on this line. And remember from the start of the talk that these direct costs will then have a modified total direct cost calculated off of them. But this specific direct cost, and in particular, the total on the right, is the one that must match the total direct costs in the task budget that we talked about initially. And to return to that example, as we see here, the task budget on the left matches that specific cell on the right. All right, now we're going to talk about calculating modified total direct cost and indirects. So modified total direct cost is calculated each year by totaling all the direct costs that are allowed to have indirect costs calculated on them. Things like salaries and wages, fringe benefits, materials, supplies, travel, subcontracts, notably not subrecipients. And for subcontracts, it's only the first $25,000 of cost incurred by each subcontract. There's a number of things that are not subject to indirect cost, things like equipment, capital expenditures, patient care charges, tuition remission, rental costs of offsite facilities, scholarships and fellowships, and then the remainder of subcontracts above $25,000, as well as subrecipient costs. Make sure to enter the modified total direct cost in the cells provided there. That's something that we see applicants missing every now and then. So double check that is there, because that is a vital number for us to be able to check your math and make sure that it's accurate. And then indirect costs are calculated off of the modified total direct cost. And I'm just going to repeat that because it's something, again, that people screw up pretty often. The indirect costs are calculated off the modified total direct cost and not the total direct cost. So take the line above that modified total direct cost and multiply it by your institution's indirect cost rate. The maximum that DPR allows is 25%, but some institutions calculate their indirects at a different rate and use whatever is appropriate for your institution. Calculate those on a yearly basis and then also in total. And then once you have entered those numbers, make sure that they sum correctly across and then down as well. And then we come to the total costs, and in some ways, these are the most important sections to make sure are accurate, that are summed by taking the total direct cost, and in this case, not the modified total direct cost, but the total direct cost, and adding the indirect costs to come up with the total that will be expended in actual dollars per year. Make sure to calculate the total costs by summing those total direct costs and the indirect costs over the entire project period. And this is a place where I would really encourage you to make sure that your math is accurate, both by row and by column, because sometimes we see inaccuracies there that are hard to rectify. And we need to go back to the applicant to make sure that their numbers are accurate. Here is an example of a filled out main budget table. I'm going to talk about this a little, but feel free to just curate it as I'm talking. I'll leave it up on screen for a second so you have a chance to digest it a little bit. Ensure that those total costs per year and total costs for the proposed project add up correctly. Again, that is vital. I can't state that enough. And that costs are entered to the nearest whole dollar and are rounded correctly there. And ensure that the costs in this main budget table also match the budget justification. So we've talked about how the main budget table total direct cost needs to match the task budget, but all of these costs also need to match the budget justification. All right, so these materials, as I've noted, can be found in the guidance documents for the research grants and alliance grants program, respectively. Those are found on the proposal application materials site for each grant program. All right, so the budget justification. Here is where you essentially explain what each of these categories is made up of. It's intended to fully justify the amounts of the main budget table. And this is one of our best tools for showing transparency because these are public funds and we're doing a competitive bidding process in our proposal stage. The applicable costs should be entered into the tables in the appropriate categories and must add up correctly. If a category is not relevant to the project, the tables can be deleted to save some page space. And we'll give an example of that at the end to demonstrate what that might look like. And all values in the main budget table must be fully justified in the budget justification. And I'll give essentially line by line explanation of what that means for each of these categories. The first of those is personnel. Often a place where a large amount of funds are devoted, but also a place where a lot of the math involves some tricky rates and things like escalators. So we're going to go through those, and we've tried to create some tables that might help you fill this out accurately. So first of all, in your personnel, list all the personnel who you know will be on the project. And also make sure you read that note there that if you have a position that you know will be working on the project, but is not yet filled, or you don't know exactly who might be working in that position, you can list TBD and a brief description of what that role would be. Here we see an example where all the personnel are filled out, and you see things like their percent level of effort, and any variation in that over the years. And then at the bottom, you'll also see an example of a personnel where no salary is requested. This is, or you might see people listed as in kind. Those are both appropriate for our projects. And the percent level of effort should still be included for any in-kind contributions. Here is a second example, this time for the sample research grants. And here you can see two TBD positions listed for undergraduate assistants that'll be helping on the project. You can see the description for those at the bottom here. Basically a brief description of what those unfilled positions would be doing, similar to the described staff. Then you'll fill out a table for each of these staff. And these tables should be filled out as appropriate for each staff person. So if they're only working in a couple years of the project, only fill out those sections of the table. And we're going to look at a couple of examples here. So on the top, you'll see an example from the sample research scope of work and budget. And on the bottom is a sample from the Alliance version. And you can see that they look largely similar here. There's things like annual increases that are included by some institutions. Other institutions use merit increases. Some use both. Often there will be varied level of effort by year depending on the position. So there's a number of different things here that get multiplied together to find the total salary requested. Make sure that the salaries and fringe benefits are calculated using that correct start date. Again, for the research on the top, you see that first year listed as 12 months, but in the Alliance on the bottom, you'll see that it's 10 months, correctly reflecting that the Alliance grants start in September. And then for both, you'll see in year 3 that it is only a 6-month project period in 2025. Next, you'll enter the fringe benefits for each staff member. And each of these will be listed in their own separate table as well. Here are 2 examples. One using, I believe one of these is from the research and one of these is from the Alliance as well. And for both of these, the fringe rate is listed as the same year by year. Some institutions project fringe rates out into the future. So depending on your institution, as appropriate, double check that you're using whatever fringe rates have been made available by your institution. And if none have been projected, it's okay to use the same fringe rate for all years of the project. And then you calculate that. Yes?
Sorry.
Yeah.
So with our salary, we put in what we are currently being paid by our employers? That's
good question. So you won't include what your, so there's a couple different answers to that question. You'll note in the budget justification, the base salary for all of the paid employees is required. So anybody that's being paid by the project needs to have their own table like this included, where their salary is multiplied by the percent effort, and then any percent increases as appropriate. For contributions that are in kind and not being paid, it's not necessary to list the salary for that employee. Is that helpful?
The last part, could you repeat that again?
Sure, talking about the in-kind contributions?
Yes.
Right, so going back to here we could see an example in the first description for Mike Robes. His effort is listed as in kind with no salary requested. So for example, the PI for this, which also is Mike Robes, would not need to fill out a salary table for that employee because the effort is in kind and no salary is requested. For the two employees under that, Pete Reedish and Ann Alicis, they are included in the salary tables because they are being paid using grant funds. Does that clear it up?
Yes, thank you.
Great. All right, so to finish that, those fringe benefit totals that you'll see in bold at the bottom are calculated by taking the total salary found in the salary table and multiplying it by the fringe rate for that year. And then all of those are summed in a table called the total personnel costs. And here's some examples of total personnel cost tables for the research and alliance samples. And again, this sums the salary totals and fringe totals for all employees into one number each. And then those are summed into yearly personnel totals. And then those yearly personnel totals must match the line in the main budget table for personnel. And this is a way to double check that all of your math is adding up correctly and make sure that your data are accurate. All right, moving on to travel. So we provide a layout of travel based off of the type of trip and some details associated with it. And the idea with these travel tables is that we hope you can use them easily for trips that occur multiple times to trim down the amount of writing about your travel that you'll have to do. So first here, you'll see a description of whether the trip occurs in year 1, year 2, year 3, or multiples of those. Broadly, the destination, duration, staff names, and a brief description of the purpose. And those categories can be pretty broad. If staff will be traveling to this location, sometimes, but maybe not in all of those instances, it's appropriate to list all of those staff. And then with each of these, there will be this table included as well. So describing the type of travel. So if it's a flight, the total number of passengers, airfare per passenger, and total flight costs, and other costs is appropriate there. The relevant per diem, and those rates, again, double check with your institution's travel policy to make sure you're using accurate numbers there. Lodging as well, make sure that you're not exceeding the maximum lodging rates established by your institution. Once you've determined those rates on the left, input those totals on the right and sum them for a total cost per trip. Multiply that by the number of times the trip will be taken for the grand total for this category of trip. Here's an example. So this is a trip in year 3 to the Central Valley for 5 days to collect, sample, and to collect data and do some sampling, participate in drone releases of parasitoid wasps. They'll be taking a personal vehicle where the distance and reimbursement rate are multiplied together to get the total. The relevant per diem rates are multiplied and listed in total on the right. Similarly, lodging is multiplied number of nights and staff and cost per day and totaled on the right. This trip will be taken twice in year 3, so the total ends up being $1,790 for this classification of trip. And then you'll want to fill out one of these for each essentially site you'll be visiting. So if, say, your project has 3 different field sites and maybe a conference that you'll be attending, you'd fill out essentially 4 of these, even if you're making multiple visits to the same site. Then those totals are summed in the total travel cost tables at the end, very similar to what we saw in personnel. And then this line must match exactly the main budget table's travel line. Another great place to check your work. Moving on to materials and supplies. Now, this table is a little bit more broadly laid out because materials and supplies is in general a very broad category. So we've provided a pretty general example here, but there's a lot of things that can be appropriately classified as materials and supplies. Here you see that things from iPads to field guides to tools to food and beverages provided at trainings and meetings. The quantity of them, and then a layout of when those costs will be incurred. And then make sure that you include a justification. There's a section to include a written justification for all the materials and supplies. And here you can do some lumping together. I would call out in particular to take a look at the third paragraph here, where you see a number of things listed in the previous table, like those hand tools and PPE kind of lumped together into one descriptive paragraph. So you don't need a specific line for everything that's listed in the table. Just a good general description of what the things will be used for. And again, what you're aiming for here is to provide reviewers with a good enough sense that you have a good, well laid out plan, and you know what you'll need to achieve it and what costs will be incurred to achieve those goals. Then, similar to what we saw in personnel and travel, make sure that the total materials and supplies costs table that you'll fill out based off of the general materials and supplies tables matches the line item in the main budget table. Then on to equipment, and we have some helpful descriptive text at the top of these. I'll point it out here in particular with equipment, very specific definition that DPR uses, that it's equipment valued at more than $5,000, useful life of more than 1 year, or that equipment definition based off of construction during the grant period that we went through prior. List each of these in the appropriate line and include a justification for each. So here we see a project that wants to purchase an automated DNA purifier and a brief description of what it would be used for in the project, and then when the cost will be incurred. Then include all of those equipment costs that the project intends to incur in the total equipment costs table, and make sure that that line item matches the main budget table's equipment line. Next, on to rent. Here, kind of similar to materials and supplies, rent is a bit of a general category that many different items or locations that can be rented might fall under. So here we provide space for a justification of what each rental is for as well. And here in our example, we see 2 different greenhouses being rented, and then a justification, again here pretty broad, pretty brief, and any associated annual increase if an item or location is being rented for multiple years. Here again, we sum the costs in the total rental costs table and mirror the costs in the main budget table to ensure that all the math is correct. Pointing out again here with rent, similar to personnel, those are particularly prone to errors where folks might not be using the correct length of the project years, both in year 1 for Alliance, again being 10 months, and in year 3 for both research and Alliance grants projects being only 6 months. So make sure that you budget your rental costs accordingly. Now on to some more discussion of subcontractor and subrecipient here in the justification. And a reminder that for each of these, you'll need to include a complete separate budget table and budget justification for all the costs incurred by the subcontractor or subawardee. So again, subcontractors are independent entities collaborating with or providing service to the applicant to complete the objectives of the grant. People that are working on the project, but not for the PI's institution or able to be paid by the PI's main institution. Subrecipients, again, are a specific classification of subcontractor that only applies to University of California and Cal State University applicants. And we're going to go through some brief examples of what these tables look like. So first, we see some examples of subcontractors, and I like this one in particular because it gives a good example of when there's two subcontractors. And actually, I see a quick rental question. Okay, so if we rent equipment, would it go in the equipment line or rent line on the budget justification? That's a great question. So in this case, I think in essentially every situation that would go under rent. For equipment, we're looking for things that are permanent and often persist after the life of the grant at the institution in which they are purchased. If there's any follow-up on that, let me know. So again, with subcontractors here, we see two different subcontractors, each with their own line item. The first being to USDA and the second being to Ag Aeronauticals. And note that both of these exceed the $25,000 indirect cost limit. So for both of these, only the first $25,000 of cost will have indirect cost added to it. Beyond that, no indirect cost will be charged to the main budget. These, again, match the line items in the main budget table. Oops. All right, and for subrecipients, here's an example. This, again, for a project, if you look at that main budget table on the bottom, you'll see here, again, that the PI is a University of California applicant, and the subrecipient is a University of California system subrecipient as well. So this is a case where the subrecipient line is appropriate to be used. And again, that main difference between subrecipients and subcontractors as far as budget tables go is that subrecipients do not have any indirect costs associated with them in the main budget table. For each of these subcontractors and subrecipients, they should have their own specific budget table and budget justification identical to what we've described here, added as addendums after the main budget and main budget justification. There's examples that you can see on the slide for a subcontractor, the first one that we talked about, the USDA subcontractor. And you can see here that it has personnel and some materials and supplies included. And then there's justification on the right, describing, similar to what we saw before, the roles of the individuals that will be working on the project at this institution, and then their salary rates. And that document continues in the sample scope of work and budget that, again, I would encourage you to review if you have any questions or would like more examples on what these things look like. All right, we're going to move on to other direct costs. I see another question. I was wondering why a CRO cannot be a subcontractor. Can you explain what a CRO is?
Contract Research Organization.
Sure. I don't think there's a specific rule prohibiting that. Do you have a reason that you think they cannot be?
I thought the earlier meetings, I thought we were told we cannot have a contract research organization to do our project along with us. And that's why I was asking that question.
I might have to follow up more specifically on that one, depending. It might have something to do with the amount of pass-through effort, where essentially the main organization is doing very little or none of the actual project work. Yeah, maybe if you wanted to follow up more specifically on that one with me via email, I could probably give you a little more specific advice.
Thank you.
Okay, moving on to other direct costs. So as we talked about before, this other direct costs section is a bit of a catch-all for things that don't fall neatly into the categories listed in the rest of the budget table. And here, the justification table is similarly broad. So we'll give some examples of what these things look like. So a really common one we see is tuition and fees, and a bit of a justification for why they're included is included here. And then these costs should be mirrored in the main budget table as well. And you'll note in the budget table on the right there, it's very important that you make the determination whether that direct cost is subject to indirect costs or not subject to indirect cost. And in the case of tuition and fees, those costs are not subject to indirect costs. Some things listed under other direct costs will. Finally, we have an example of what it looks like if you have unneeded categories. And this is something that is particularly common in the subcontractor or subaward justifications, where they might not be including many of these things. So to save page space, you can delete out all those tables and just include NA. Then the total indirect costs have a single line in the justification to include them. This is something that we've definitely seen people miss filling out. So make sure you go down to the bottom of that budget justification and fill this line out. And then that line needs to mirror the total indirects listed in the main budget table. And this is one of those particularly good places to check your math to make sure that everything makes sense, calculating them based both off of the modified total direct cost and then also summing them through the categories in your justification. An important note here again on rates, DPR allows a maximum of 25% indirect cost to be charged. Some institutions may use a rate that is lower than this, so make sure that you include the appropriate rate. And then here is a bit of a simplified explanation of that $25,000 limit and how it is applied to the budget table. So what we see here on the top is a total cost for a subcontractor, in this case, $34,500, and the years in which it'll be incurred, $15,000 in the first, $12,000 in the second, $7,500 in the third. And what this table is attempting to show is that the $25,000 cap is applied temporally. So it's the first $25,000 that are incurred. And we see that on the second line. All $15,000 in year one will have indirect costs applied and included in that modified total direct cost. In year two, however, only the first 10,000 of the 12,000 will be included in that modified total direct cost and have indirects applied to them. $2,000 will not be. And then in year three, all of the costs beyond and above that $25,000 cap will not have indirect costs associated with them and not be included in the modified total direct cost. All right, so we have a few minutes remaining here for questions. If you have questions that are not addressed either today or that you develop after the session ends, I would really encourage you to reach out to us at dprpmgrants.solicitation@cdpr.ca.gov. And all the materials that I've talked about today can be found on our grants program webpage. That's cdpr.ca.gov/dprgrants.htm, or easily found via a quick Google search for DPR grants program. And at this point, I'll open the floor up to any questions you might have. I know that was a lot of dense information concerning these budgets. And some of these questions might not be developed until you have a chance to actually go in and start working with these tables yourself. But we're happy to help with whatever we can today. So. All right, I see a question, Peter.
Okay, thank you very much. I just have a question regarding the eligibility for subcontractors.
Yes.
Are they supposed to? Is there any limitation on that? Should subcontractors be operating in California, or can the work be done out of state if it still contributes directly to the project, the main project?
Yeah, so great question. This is actually one that we get pretty often, and we address in some of our other talks, and I would encourage you guys to go and review those if you have a chance. But largely, the answer is that project work can be conducted outside of California, even by the main PI. However, there's strong requirements that reviewers will be taking into account that are that the project must primarily benefit Californians. And if work is conducted outside of California, that the conditions it's conducted in be California-like, which is a bit of a broad description. And it's something that is incumbent on the applicant to demonstrate that they would be meeting. So if, say, you were working in an agricultural area, it would be a good idea to include information on why that environment is representative of a California environment. For things like lab work, it's often a little bit easier to justify conducting work out of state where conditions are essentially identical. Is that helpful?
Yeah, that is helpful. I would have a follow-up question, but I'll let others ask their questions.
Sure. Let me pop into the chat quick, and then we'll grab you after those are completed. So in the chat, I see two questions. First, can a contingency be added to the budget? If so, is there a cap? And what category line will it go under on the budget justification? That is a good question. Could you give a little more explanation of what you mean by a contingency?
Yeah, hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, well, we're just in case there's some additional costs maybe that we weren't anticipating in the project. We were just wondering if there's like, if we can add, you know, like a 10 or 15% contingency within.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we don't allow that specific type of model, but what I would point out is that these budgets represent projections and best estimates. So we really want you to do your best job of predicting what your costs will be, but we do know that those will not specifically match reality, just because of the vagaries of rising and lowering costs, et cetera. The eventual grantees that are funded through our programs are bound by the maximum funding that the project allocates. So we can't exceed the amount that is awarded. So I would say to make sure that your project can be completed using the funds that would be awarded to your application.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yep. And then the second question in the chat before getting back to Peter, how many subcontractors are allowed to be involved in a project? So that number is not capped. This maybe is something that is more a question of how reviewers will look at your project. I think in general, reviewers tend to have a slightly lower opinion of projects where the principal investigator is conducting less and less and less of the project and subcontracting out more and more of the project to lots of different entities. I think there's a bit of value associated with a strong main PI who demonstrates knowledge and expertise in their subject area. And if you go and look at the criteria for our reviewers, which are published in our solicitation, and I believe some in the proposal application as well, there's a lot of information about how reviewers are going to look at projects. And some of those things like the qualifications of the team might play into answers to this question as well, but there is no formal cap. All right, back to Peter.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity. I realize that travel is supposed to be within the state of California. And so this comes back to my question about subcontractors. If, for instance, the subcontract portion of the work requires some travel, will this be discounted as not being eligible?
Right. So unfortunately, if you needed to, say, travel to a collaborator's facility that was outside the state, that would not be travel that could be funded by grant funds.
Okay. Another thing has to do with the involvement of a consultant to do a particular, specific, to provide a specific contribution. If the consultant would have to travel from out of state to California, will this be considered eligible?
I would have to double check on that, but I believe that is ineligible as well.
Okay.
I would
Alright.
need to double check on that, and I can get back to you on that one.
Okay. All right. Thank you for these answers.
Yeah, great. Okay, other questions? We have a few minutes left here. These are all great questions you guys have so far. And as we get close to wrapping up here, I will mention that I noted at the top, this is one in a series of virtual information sessions that we are holding this year. There are a number still on the calendar. Today actually does mark the 2 weeks out deadline from the research grant proposal application solicitation period closing. So for all of you research grant applicants, there is one more session that you might want to attend next week. But for any interested Alliance grant applicants, there are virtual information sessions continuing all the way until near the Alliance grants application deadline in December. So please visit our website to find links to all of those meetings as well as past meetings. There is a bit of a lag between when the meeting occurs and when the recordings and PDFs will be posted, as we make sure that all the materials are in compliance with the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act. All right, well, great. I really appreciate everyone's, oh, I see one more question sneaking out. No, just a thank you for the presentation. You're welcome. Well, and thank you all for your attention today. I hope this information has been helpful in developing great proposal applications. Once again, just a quick review of those deadlines. The research grants application deadline is coming up on September 22nd, and the Alliance grants proposal application deadline is December 8th. We hope you all submit applications and get back to us with any questions that you develop after the presentation. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.